My name is Julie Nash. I think probably most of you know me. I'm the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, and this is one of my favorite events of the year. And like Julie Chen, I'm sorry that it's not in person, but I've thoroughly enjoyed learning what I've learned so far this evening. And it's definitely my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the night, Dr. Keith Mitchell, a colleague of mine in the English department, where he's an associate professor. His areas of expertise include African American, Caribbean, 19th and 20th century American literature, and I'm not exaggerating when I say a whole lot of other things. Keith is one of the most well-versed human beings I have had the pleasure to meet in my lifetime. I have yet to find a topic that he doesn't know a lot about. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about teaching. Dr. Mitchell went to college at Emory University in Atlanta and then to graduate school at the University of North Carolina, where he and a young woman classmate became the first two African-American students to earn PhDs in comparative literature. Dr. Mitchell has received numerous awards for his dedication to teaching and service, including the Student Government Outstanding Teaching Award, the English Department Outstanding Teaching Award, the Haskell Memorial Award for Distinguished Online Teaching, and this year, the most prestigious award for teaching the university gives, which is the 2020 Manning Prize for Teaching Excellence. He has also served in multiple service roles, including on the Honors College Advisory Board, co-teaching an Honors College Symposium on the Harlem Renaissance, and he's currently working on a book on African Americans' literary responses to the war in Vietnam. Please join me in welcoming Keith Mitchell.
Good evening, everyone. First, I have a few thank yous myself. I would like to first thank Vice Provost Julie Nash for inviting me to be this year's keynote speaker. I would also like to thank Chancellor Maloney and Provost Hartman, Dean Falcone, and all my wonderful colleagues in the English department for their unwavering support and inspiration. And I'd also finally like to thank Amber Squires and Eric C., and also Eric Allen. I know there are many other people who helped to put this wonderful event together, but these are the three that I've worked with closely over the last few days. A shout out to all three of them for doing such a superb job. They are amazing. My talk for today is entitled Building and Teaching Empathy Through Storytelling in a Time of Crisis. So like many of you, I have spent a great deal of my life in the classroom teaching students from many, many different backgrounds. We, all of us, are well-trained and highly educated instructors whose purpose is not only to teach and to instruct, but whose purpose I also feel is to be mentors for our students and also to be sort of de facto role models of empathy and care for our students. Now, UML is one of the most diverse institutions of higher education in the region. And as you all know, the majority of our students are first generation and from working class backgrounds, like I'm sure many of you are and like I am. So while through this common background, I feel profoundly connected to my students, they, of course, at least initially, generally have very little knowledge about who I am as a person outside of the classroom and the details of my journey, being raised in a working class family, living in the semi-segregated South of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to my current career here as an instructor at UMass Lowell. It sort of reminded me of like when we were folks of my generation, when we were going to school and of course, in middle school or in elementary school and seeing our teachers, outside of the classroom, like going to the grocery store or at the bank or you're at a retail shop and our jaws would just drop. We're like, oh, Mrs. Smith, she actually eats what? What's going on here? And so, I think that's how our students initially see us. They see us not necessarily as human beings, but as more likely that we are the people who will, as instructors, who will be in part the ones who will determine the grade that they will potentially receive in the class at the end of the semester. But of course, this is not how I want them primarily to see me and to interact with me inside and outside of the classroom. Because I feel this way of thinking, not being able to be vulnerable or not showing vulnerability, I think it forecloses our students getting to know us as human beings and allowing us to know them as human beings. Instead, I want them to see me and to interact with me, not just as an instructor, but as a person who has had to or who is currently dealing with some of the very same issues that they have had to deal with or are dealing with right now, especially in this pandemic era. Now, students, as we all know, receive a lot of information regarding what is going on in the world, what is going on in the United States through social media, through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and other platforms. And I'm sure dozens of other platforms that I've never heard of. And strangely enough, and I read this a few weeks ago, apparently studies have shown that over time, that social media has an overall positive effect on affective and cognitive empathy in young people. I never would have thought that was the case, because a lot of times when I think about social media, I think about students not being connected with each other or connected to the world, but much more so as disconnected. However, I also want to push back on that a little bit, because I think especially in this era of COVID and during the pandemic, we see nowadays that students are suffering arguably to a greater degree, from all kinds of different kinds of anxieties and psychological stresses that might lend them to not do their very best in our classrooms, or perhaps even to completely shut down or disappear from our classes. And I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that they are so bombarded with information on a daily basis, and most of that information is negative, right, or bad news. And so, and to be honest, I'm not myself a social media savvy. I'm not on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, or any of those things. And I don't know a whole lot about these platforms or their uses. But I don't mention this fact about myself out of any kind of false sense of, smugness or superiority. I know a lot of people are just so against social media and computers and technology and all that. It's terrible. It's terrible. The world is coming to an end. No, I have a very different reason for mentioning this. Given the fact that young people that we teach are very much wired into many of these social engagement platforms that I've mentioned, I recognize also that many of you effectively use various social media platforms to engage your students and to help students reach your course objectives and to do the kinds of interesting and stimulating work that can lead them to be successful on macro and micro levels. Now, I particularly feel that our mandate, or at least part of our mandate, is that we create an environment where students feel that they can be themselves. And in part, in order for them to do that, I think we as instructors have to be comfortable enough to be vulnerable with our students. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So I recognized early on that I'm not really able to relate to my students in terms of, when they're talking about social media and such. However, I feel that I absolutely can relate to them on a more old-fashioned, I put that in quotation, old-fashioned method of communication, and that is through storytelling. Now, having taught over 30 years, I have found that storytelling is a way of augmenting the empathetic development of our students, especially in this current moment, in this, what I call this age of anxiety, this pandemic age that we're living in. And I think that this is where my background and training as a literature professor comes into play regarding my teaching philosophy and my some of my pedagogical strategies, and my desire to foster and to nurture empathy in my students. Now, to me, storytelling is an extremely effective tool to be able to supplement the development of empathy, not only in our students, but in empathy in our students for other people. We in this country right now, at this moment, I think we in the world find ourselves in an existential crisis, a deep existential crisis, with the pandemic, with the election, with the social unrest that's going on. This is an unprecedented time for any of us to be living in. And so one of the ways I wanted to, especially since the pandemic, but I've always done this, but even more so now, one of the ways that I've been able to, I think, effectively get students to be much more vulnerable and to be much more empathetic is to design my courses in a way that connects the literature that I'm teaching, or whatever it is I'm teaching in the classroom, to the contemporary moment and to their lives. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I do this both formally and informally. So one of the formal things that I've done a few weeks ago, this is an exercise that I did a few weeks ago, is that one of the courses that I teach, and what I'm teaching right now, is this course called American Literary Traditions. And it's a survey course, and I teach American literature from the colonial period to the present. And it's a lot of material. But at any rate, a couple of weeks ago, we were sort of in the middle of this historical period of American literature around the 1920s, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, those folks, T.S. Eliot. And so one of the poets that I have my students read is an African-American poet who was part of the Harlem Renaissance. And he was writing in the 1920s and 30s, Claude McKay. And he wrote this very fascinating poem, a wonderful poem, a very inspiring poem called If We Must Die. Maybe some of you are familiar with that poem. It's by Claude McKay. We started talking about, with this poem, let me give you a little bit of background about the poem. So Claude McKay wrote this poem in 1919. And this poem was a response to what was happening to African Americans across the country in the United States in the 1920s. Especially with the unprecedented uptick in violence against African Americans, after the First World War. And so this was a poem that I wanted students to read and for us to discuss in class as part of their homework for the next class. And also what I had them do was to, in addition to reading Claude McKay's poem, was to look at a YouTube video. It was about an 8 or 9 minute video on another event that happened in 1919 called the Elaine, Arkansas Massacre. And what had happened during this particular time in Elaine, Arkansas, was that there were a number of African Americans in this small town in Arkansas who were fighting not only for their civil rights, but fighting for the right to unionize. And of course, the powers that be in the town, the sheriff and other white citizens in the town, were adamantly opposed to that. And so there was a rumor that went around that, African Americans were on the rampage and et cetera, the same old stories. And so what happened was that the sheriff, gathered together a posse, which turned into a whole mob. And they basically, killed about a dozen African Americans, murdered a dozen African Americans, and put dozens and dozens of African Americans in jail just for advocating for their civil rights and wanting to unionize. So I had students look at that video. I had students read the Claude McKay poem, and then I had them do a writing exercise. I wanted them, I didn't know what they knew about what was happening in terms of the social justice movements going on in the United States, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. But I wanted them to see where they were at and what they felt about these movements. But I wanted them also to connect what is happening right now in the United States with that video, what they learned from the video about Elaine, Arkansas, and that massacre, and Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die. And I tell you, it was one of the most interesting and the most fruitful discussions that I've had in quite some time in my classes. Students were able to be vulnerable and to talk about their anxieties and to talk about, and we not only talked about the Black Lives Matter and social injustice and these kinds of issues, but we also started talking about, the election and the anxiety leading up to the election. And we started talking about the pandemic. And it was just such a fruitful, wonderful conversation to have with my students. And it allowed them to be vulnerable. It allowed me to be vulnerable. And it allowed me and my students to be empathetic and sympathetic towards one another. And so it was an amazing exercise, and it really worked well. And I think my students got a lot out of it. The other thing that I usually do, and I've been doing this since I began teaching, is, I talk to my students about what it was like growing up in the South. I talk to my students what it was like, coming from a working class family in which my parents could not afford to send me to college. And, I had to work, and I worked a lot of jobs. You name it, I probably did it, right? Legally, right? You name it, I probably did it as an undergraduate and in graduate school. And also taking out student loans, having to take out a lot of loans. things that our students are going through right now. And so all throughout, the semester when I'm teaching, if there's an occasion for me to talk about something that I think that they can relate to from my own life, that's what I do. And I think it builds trust. I think it builds empathy. And I think it allows students to be vulnerable, and it allows them to say what's on their minds. And I think this is a really, really good thing, because of vulnerability and telling our own personal stories, because I know many of you have similar stories. Think about all the things that you have gone through, all your trials and tribulations, how you have overcome the things that you have been able to overcome, how you are working through what is going on right now with the pandemic and the election and the social unrest. These are stories I would encourage you to talk to your students about, to tell your students about things that you have experienced, as a way of showing them that they're not alone, that yes, you are human too, like they are, and that these very same things that they have gone through and are going through, you've gone through them too, and you've overcome them. That's very important. That's very important to me. Now, I know I don't have a lot of time left, and so what I would like to do is I would like to, if Eric, if you would put up the slide. I came across a poem about, as a literature person, I came across a poem about a month ago, and this poem is by Jericho Brown. And Jericho Brown is a young and up-and-coming African-American poet, and the poem really struck me, and I love Jericho Brown's. He has 2 collections of poetry that he's published so far, but it was published in the New York Times in last June, and it struck me as being very, very important to what's happening right now. And so I had planned something for my students to do, like for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then I scrapped it. I was like, I want my students to read this poem and for us to discuss this poem. This poem is very special to me because it's one of the first poems that I've come across that specifically is about the pandemic. And it's a poem that is specifically targeted in an homage to those frontline workers. And I know many of you have family members who are frontline workers. I have family members who are frontline workers, and I know that a lot of our students are frontline workers. And even more specifically, Jericho Brown's poem is an homage to those grocery store workers. And just as a side note, part of the reason why I wanted to introduce this story to the class and to all of you is because as we're going through this holiday season, we're going to be, out and about. We're going to be going to the grocery stores, and we're going to be going to the post office to mail packages off, and we're going to be going to retail stores, and it's going to be a madhouse. And we're going to get frustrated, and we're going to be, we're going to get upset, and there are going to be long lines. And this poem that Jericho Brown wrote is about, it reminds us to be empathetic. When the guy or the person in front of you is just causing so much trouble and you're like, why isn't this line moving? Just think about this poem. And I wanted to share this poem with you to let you know that you're not alone. So this poem is called Say Thank You, Say I'm Sorry. So the speaker of the poem says, "No, I don't know whose side you're on, but I'm here for the people who work in grocery stores that glow in the morning and close down for deep cleaning at night. Right up the street and in cities I pronounce and mispronounce, in towns too tiny for my big black car to quit, and in every wide corner of Kansas where going to school means at least one trip to the slaughterhouse. I want so little, another leather-bound book, a gimlet with a lavender gin, bread so good when I taste it, I can tell you how it's made. I'd like us to rethink what it is to be a nation. I'm in a mood about America. Today, I have PTSD about the Lord. God save the people who work in grocery stores. They know a bit about glamour. There's a lot of glamour. They know how much it costs for the elders of us to eat, to save my loves and not my sentences. Before I see them, I draw a mole near my left dimple and flare to the smile that they can't see behind my mask. I grin or lie, or maybe I wear the mouth of a beast, or I eat wild animals, while some of us grow up knowing what gnocchi is. The people who work at the grocery stores don't care. They say thank you. They say sorry. We don't sell motor oil anymore. With the grief so thick, you could touch it. Go on, touch it. It's early. It's late. They have washed their hands. They have washed their hands for you. And they take the bus home. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you tonight. I look forward to listening to some more of these panels, and take care.